And we're live. Hello, everybody. It's early in the morning on Long Island. It's not early in the morning, as you can see behind me, in the Adelaide Hills. I'm joined today by someone who needs no introduction as far as our students are concerned. So for once, I'm not going to give her an introduction. I'm just going to say hello, Stephanie, and how are you?
I'm all right, Stephen. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Good.
The reason why I asked Stephanie to have a chat is because we've been obviously covering an introduction to MMT and the financial system in one of the subjects this trimester. And we've got to that point in the term where we started talking about fiscal sustainability. And everybody, I'm sure, is aware. I don't know what it's like in the US, but in Australia, every second journalist, including people who should know better, and some economists that I've spoken to or even been interviewed by in the recent past, who I know better, have slipped back into the old way of talking about fiscal sustainability. They blame higher inflation on what they characterize as imprudent fiscal policy and monetary policy over the last couple of years. And they are arguing for a more rapid reduction in government deficits and fiscal austerity and everything that goes along with that. So I thought I'd ask Stephanie, what does that term fiscal sustainability mean, particularly from our perspective?
Okay, well, from our perspective, a fiscal position, let's say, let's just put it like this. The number that falls out of the budget box at the end of the year, this thing we call either a fiscal deficit, a fiscal surplus, or a balanced budget. If we're asking the question, is that sustainable? Do we mean through time, can the same number fall out of the box year after year after year? And does that indicate sustainability? If the answer is yes, does that make the government's fiscal position sustainable? It's quite possible, Stephen, that fiscal surpluses would be sustainable over some period of time. You've had fiscal surpluses in Australia for a period of time. We had them many, many years ago for a period of time in the US. Here in the US, it was clear to some people like Wynne Godley that those surpluses were not sustainable, that the government's fiscal position was unsustainable. Now, why? Because a surplus means that the government is, in effect, taking more money out of the economy each year than it is putting back in, right? Tax revenues exceed government spending. And so the surplus is effectively reducing the size of the non-government balance, right? So the government surpluses are mirrored by deficits in the non-government sector. The question then becomes, how long can the non-government part of the economy survive in the deficit position? And now, conversely, can a government sustain fiscal deficits? Are they sustainable? Well, the answer has to be yes, because in my lifetime, the US government budget has been in deficit in all but about 4 years. And they are sustainable in the sense that they have been non-inflationary over the majority of that time. Those fiscal deficits have occurred alongside an economy that has not overheated, that did not produce high levels of inflation that become problematic, that make the deficit effectively not unsustainable, but I would say undesirable, right? Beyond some point, a deficit too large becomes undesirable, even if it is sustainable in the sense that the checks will all clear, the government won't go bankrupt, and that sort of thing.
That reminds me a little bit of, it might be the first time I ever saw you talking about anything online, when you talked about the distinction between fiscal hawks and fiscal doves, which is the narrative that we're surrounded with people from either one of those perspectives or the other, and fiscal owls. And of course, everybody, a lot of students might be aware of the term deficit owl, and the use of that term to refer to the MMT approach to government budgeting and fiscal policy. There are a lot of fiscal hawks and an increasing number of fiscal doves about at the moment. In Australia, for example, we seem to, the Conservatives who are now in opposition, they're reverting towards being hawks again, even though they weren't in power. And the Labor government, we have a budget in 2 days' time in Australia, and they're talking like doves at the moment. The economy is growing rapidly. They're concerned about having $1 trillion of government debt, interest payments on that debt in the future, taking up a bigger and bigger share of the budget. The Treasurer even said the other day that he needed to build up more buffers in case there's a downturn in the economy, so they can afford to do something to support the economy should that happen. This I've asked the question and answered it really, but those terms, are they? Do you still find them useful?
Oh, you mean the hawks and the doves?
The hawks and the doves, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. You know, the main difference between a deficit hawk and a deficit dove is really speed, right? Scott Fulwiler used to say this. It's the pace at which they want to arrive at the same destination. So the differences are subtle, right? Both are eager to see deficits brought down, to see balanced budgets. The deficit hawks wanting to get there much more quickly, and so more willing to embrace, you know, harsh austerity in order to wrestle the deficit back to the ground. Doves being a bit more patient, especially when the economy is not entirely back on its, you know, secure footing, and saying, well, okay, we have to run deficits for a bit longer, even though we really think they're not a good idea and we wish we didn't have to do that. But we'll be more patient and go more slowly, but we're all headed to the same destination. And the doves just being, you know, completely in a different category and saying, why on earth is the goal, right? Why is the goal, the aim, the objective of government policy to achieve any particular budget outcome, to see any number fall out of the budget box at the end of the year, bigger number, smaller number, zero, you know, whatever. So I think it's still useful conceptually to divide sort of the way of thinking this group relative to the way I imagine the deficit owls. It's funny because just over the top of my computer, sitting on a like a concrete pedestal, something outside in my yard, is an owl about 2.5 feet tall, staring back at me.
Is there an owl looking over your shoulder at the moment?
Yeah,
I think so. Oh wow, yeah, I can see it. I think there's another one behind you on the
Oh, there probably are. Those
shelves. Yeah,
those have been gifts over the years that I've gotten from people. But this one out here is Mr. Kelton, some Christmas or Mother's Day or something. So the thing just sits there and looks at me. It's sort of funny.
Okay, so suppose we've managed to persuade everybody the right way of thinking about the government budget is from the perspective of the fiscal owl, and they then say, okay, that's fine, but deficits were much too big over the last couple of years, and for that matter, monetary policy made things even worse with zero or virtually zero interest rates and quantitative easing. Inflation has taken off because you spent too much. So we need to cut back on spending at the moment. We need to rapidly reduce even more rapidly than deficits are falling anyway. Reduce the deficit. Now is the time that you should be running a surplus because the economy is growing so quickly and unemployment is so low and there's too much spending, and that's why inflation has remained persistently high. Is that right?
No, I mean, look, if the economy were in fact growing so quickly, that of course would have the effect of reducing the size of the government deficit. In other words, that's one pathway to getting where these folks say they want to get, which is to see smaller deficits. That's happening here in the US. We have just seen, and President Biden has been, on TV and tweeting about this and thinks this is a very good thing. And he's out there saying that we have historic record deficit reduction in the US. In the last fiscal year, the fiscal deficit fell by half. Okay. So we have seen, in a sense, a historic collapse in the size
same
of the
thing here.
Yeah.
The same thing here.
So
we don't get quite the same message, but the same thing.
Oh yeah, no, this is a big pats on the back and, ready to throw a parade to celebrate the historic collapse in the government deficit. And it's fallen for a couple of main reasons. One is precisely what you said, the economic growth, the recovery. We had a very robust recovery. Remember, in the US context, and I don't know your numbers the way that I know them here, you can fill in the gaps. But here in the US, at the start of the pandemic, we lost 22 million jobs in the first 2 months of the pandemic, 22 million jobs. Now, that was a record, job loss for sure. But do you know that because of the mostly fiscal response that, put a floor under incomes and supported jobs in the economy and so forth, we had the shortest recession in US history. Okay? We were officially out of recession in 2 months. So then what followed, very, strong economic recovery, robust growth, tax revenues increased sharply, which of course reduces the deficit. And then all of that pandemic related spending, all of the legislation, the multi-trillion-dollar stuff rolled off. We finished that, right? So that spending to support the economy has effectively dried up. So as government spending came sharply down and tax revenues moved up in a strong recovering economy, the deficit naturally shrunk. Okay, so a combination of those things. So the debate now is really about this lingering inflation that we have. And do we need to therefore go further with fiscal policy? Do we need more cuts? Do we need to do more to try to actively reduce the size of the deficit in order to bring inflation down? That's a debate you're obviously having there. We hear that sort of thing here. I've tried to write about this in a way that says, we've got a couple of choices in front of us. One is to recognize how much of the current inflation is still related to supply side factors, to things that don't have anything to do with fiscal spending, overspending, overheating the economy, any of that. Recognize how much of the inflation is due to other things. Still, the impacts of COVID and bottlenecks in supply chain, and then Russia, Ukraine, and all those other things that neither monetary nor fiscal policy are really going to help us get at in the near term. And recognize that, things are improving on the inflation front, at least here in the US. There are all sorts of indications that inflation is coming down. JP Morgan put out a note to clients just the other day. They see, now this is a major, investment bank, right? Huge financial institution. JP Morgan says by the end of this year, they think inflation will be down to about 6.8% here in the US. That's headline inflation. And by the end of next year, 3.2%. Stephen, if we're at 3.2% next year, it's out of the system. There's no fear of inflation becoming entrenched, of expectations becoming unhinged, of a wage price spiral, all this sort of stuff that motivates people to want to go more aggressive against inflation. There are no signs that I can see that those are real concerns. Inflation is coming down. It's likely to come down. The wild cards here being obviously Russia and Ukraine. Any weird thing that might happen with a new strain with COVID, and maybe China. I mean, there are wild cards that can, leave us in a different place come the end of next year. But, I think the baseline scenario is for continued improvements, disinflation over the course of the next 12 and 18 months, and without the need for policies oriented at trying to effectively crush demand for the sake of bringing inflation down.
And yeah, I suspect that when the inflation rate comes down, all the usual suspects will be saying it's because of the Fed increasing the federal funds rate and maybe the Inflation Reduction Act putting further downward pressure on the deficit.
I don't know.
It won't be.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with your first point. If we got that coveted soft landing, right, that everybody was sort of hoping for in the early phase, I don't think there are many soft landing people left out there. You know, Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, used to talk about, he thought that the Fed could probably orchestrate a so-called soft landing where interest rates move higher. It lets a little bit of the air out of the inflation bubble, and we sort of navigate on a glide path back down toward a 2% inflation rate. And then he switched to starting to saying things like, well, there's going to be pain. And people heard pain, and then they said, okay, that doesn't sound like a soft landing anymore. So we then kind of started thinking differently. Look, if the Fed were to somehow manage to not break something in the financial system, to not break something that causes unemployment to go from, say, 3.5% to 6%, or, you know, something like that, where everybody could point to this and say, well, okay, inflation came down, but you had to break the economy, or you had to break something in order to do it. They're not going to get, I think, the same kind of credit for those policy moves that they would have gotten if it had happened in a more, you know, pain-free sort of way. But probably you're right that as inflation comes down on its own, which it would have done anyway, and alongside that, the Fed has been raising interest rates. Some people will say, you see, monetary policy works. Raising interest rates brought down inflation. On the Inflation Reduction Act, I just don't think that stuff is rolling out soon enough, really, to probably garner much of the credit. That's kind of a 10-year program. A lot of it relies on people like, you know, me going out and buying heat pumps to improve the energy efficiency of our homes, or electric vehicles, or businesses taking advantage of subsidies and tax breaks and rebates and all this kind of stuff to make those investments to spend. And it's, I gotta say, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act, that's what people are really calling our climate policy, because there is like $370 billion in that package for climate related spending. But that's over 10 years. So it's really only about $37 billion a year, which frankly isn't all that much.
In a huge economy.
In
and
a huge economy.
That would be sensible in an economy the size of Australia's economy.
You see, and so we're calling it historic investments in climate because it's the biggest we've ever committed to. So in that sense, it's true that it's historic. But given the challenges we face, it is very modest, right? It's very modest. And the other thing is that it relies so heavily, as I just said, on companies and households taking advantage of the incentives, the tax breaks and the subsidies and the rebates, so that you go out and buy that electric vehicle, that you put the solar panels on your home, that you, companies invest in green tech and innovation and all that. The problem, of course, is that we're in a rising interest rate environment and everybody is talking about recession. So what company is going to go out and borrow to make the investments in the manufacturing capacity to do more green production of green industry? Who's going to borrow to buy a $50,000 electric vehicle because the government's going to help you out and give you $7,000, or, you know, put heat pumps in your home, which cost many, many, many thousands of dollars to make that conversion because you get a bit of a tax break? People, you have to finance this stuff, right? Interest rates are going up. People are worried about recession. I'm worried about how much take up there's going to be from households and from firms to make these kind of investments, which are vital, right, to making any kind of progress at all in greening our way we live and produce and so forth. If the Fed is raising interest rates and making it more expensive to borrow to make these investments, I'm not optimistic about how much take up there's going to be on the other end of all of this.
Oh, that's really interesting, particularly because we've got almost as many American students as we have Australians. We have a few British students as well. What's happened in the UK, and has anything happened there which would be a surprise to an MMT economist?
No, I mean, well, the whole fiasco is in some sense surprising, right?
To anyone, really.
Yeah, to anyone. But in terms of like what made headlines, was that did that come as a total shock? Could we understand that from an MMT, framework? I think the answer is we can understand what happened using the MMT lens or the MMT framework. I mean, obviously the British government, the UK is a currency issuer, right? The British pound comes from the British government. They are the issuer of the currency, and I'm talking about the Bank of England, as the sort of consolidated reference to the British government. But the pound comes from the UK government, and it doesn't come from anywhere else. And so what we witnessed was, a new government come in and pronounce that they had their economic package included some subsidies to help with the high cost of energy for households and companies, and sort of across the board tax cuts, especially aimed at people at the very top of the income distribution. So this so-called, supply side economics, trickle down, all that sort of stuff. And they lay out their package, and what you saw kind of immediately was basically bond markets take a gasp. And I think the gasp that they took was, hang on, inflation is running around 10% at the moment. We have an inflation targeting central bank. The central bank is going to look at this economic program and say, why are you doing quote unquote fiscal stimulus, right? Why are you doing this in an inflationary environment? This is going to force us to redouble our efforts. In other words, the expectation was that the Bank of England would likely move more aggressively in light of the announced fiscal package. That means higher interest rates. And if you're in bond markets and you think that the central bank is going to go even more aggressively with interest rates, what do? Do exactly what we saw investors do, which is move out of gilts, right? Try to get out of government bonds. And so yields spiked, and then that created problems. As I don't know how into this stuff you get with your students, but pension funds with liability-driven investment decisions came under pressure and margin calls, and that intensified things until the Bank of England stepped in and kept interest rates from climbing even higher.
That's we talk about that a little bit. Defined benefit pension funds that have liabilities that they have to meet in the future, that have to generate a certain level of returns. In recent years, with low interest rates, have engaged in investment strategies, which meant that they were exposed to losses and to margin calls if the yield on government debt started to increase. That led to the beginnings of a panic, but the Bank of England was able to put the panic rapidly to an end, because what they demonstrated is what we often say, which is that if the central bank wants any particular yield on government debt to be wherever it wants it to be, then it's always in the position to deliver on that, because it's got limitless pockets. And
So you know, a lot of the press became, this was bond markets tisking the government and saying, we won't allow you to do this, right? We will shut your program down. And what it really was just a classic liquidity crisis. And in fact, rates increasing, had they increased, at a more measured pace, would have actually been good for these pension funds. It was the speed at which it happened that resulted in this sort of situation where, the value decreased and the margin calls came. But I think that it's a very important and potentially dangerous historical example now, because people can look back at what happened, and they're already doing it, and say, you see, this is why it is vital that governments produce credible packages, that they subject them to the appropriate evaluation by the OBR or CBO here in the US, or some, budget scorekeeper takes a look at the plans and costs.
It's the Parliamentary Budget Office here, yeah.
Yeah.
Which institutions outside the US countries outside the US didn't used to have. We've got the US in the relatively recent past.
And now there's such deference to these. Now the Truss and her chancellor tried to just say, we're not really interested in what you have to say. I thought that was fantastic, frankly.
Yeah.
But a lot of people said, oh, this is just further evidence of how unserious their plans are, and they're going to get punished by markets for this. And then when yields moved sharply higher, people said, see, I told you so. You have to put your economic program before an independent body that evaluates the soundness of your fiscal plans. And if you don't go through all the motions and behave in a very fiscally responsible way, the markets will come back and effectively, shut your plans down. And it's unfortunate, in my view. I didn't. It's not that I was, enthusiastic about what Truss and company were proposing, tax cuts for the very rich and so forth. But the government should have been able to carry out its economic agenda. It should have. And what happened is, because of that, the wobbling in markets, in financial markets, the government blinked, Truss blinked, and the Bank of England got its way. And it's not bond vigilantes that got their way. It's the Bank of England that got its way. And the British government, backed off and tried to unwind. Well, we'll only go halfway with the tax cuts, and we'll only do a little bit on the energy side. And ultimately, as everybody knows, she was forced out. But I do think it's potentially dangerous to have this serve as an example if it's misinterpreted, if what happened is misunderstood as the so-called bond vigilantes coming in and being in control of what a currency issuing government can do for its people when it wants to commit resources, when it wants to commit to spending, or for that matter, cutting taxes to create incentives or to support an economy. To have this example could potentially hamstring policymaking in years ahead. If every government that comes after comes into it with the belief that the only way to proceed safely is to, fully offset all spending, so that you're never proposing to do anything that would add to the deficit, then I think it's going to be extremely hard to get, good policy in that kind of constrained environment.
I don't think it was a market wobble. I think it was a politician's wobble. I think but everybody with any talent really in the Conservative Party had already given up on being Prime Minister. So they ended up with someone who was not, again, the budget I thought was slightly crazy in terms of the cut to the higher tax rate. But if Boris Johnson had still been Prime Minister, he just would have stared the governor of the Bank of England down. The Bank of England would have had to back down because it's its job to maintain financial stability.
Exactly.
And that would have been the end of the story.
Exactly.
Really.
Exactly. Yeah. If the rates aren't consistent, if you just sit back and say, well, we're just going to let markets take rates higher, well, that's a policy choice. And if you allow that to happen and those rates become inconsistent, incompatible with your monetary policy objectives and or financial stability, then you're going to move, right? You're going to intervene and you're going to reset yields to either, deal with the financial instability problem or to manage rates down to levels that are compatible with your macro objectives. So I agree. Well, maybe we're going to get to see what Boris Johnson.
Oh God, no, please. Well, the amazing things are happening in the UK. I should say this on something for students, and we're supposed to be sort of politically neutral, but my father, who spent 65 years voting Conservative, tells me he's going to vote Labour at the next election. So to manage to achieve that, they've certainly achieved something I didn't think I'd see in his lifetime. I don't want to keep you much longer because you've been very kind to chat to us anyway. But there's one other thing which kind of relates to what we've just been discussing that I thought I'd mention, and that is when more intelligent, is that right? When the best mainstream economists talk about fiscal sustainability, people like David Andolfato, they talk about, and in fact, I was just commenting on something he said on Twitter before we started chatting. They talk about the relationship between the average yield on government debt and the growth rate in GDP. And they say if the interest rate on government debt is above the growth rate on GDP, then even if you're not running primary budget deficits, unless you run surpluses, the ratio of government debt to GDP will increase explosively over time, and at some point that will cause a crisis or hyperinflation. And so he said, he wrote down on Twitter sort of an hour ago that if R is less than G, he agrees with the MMT people as far as the government budget is concerned, but if R is greater than G, it's goodbye MMT. That's what he said. I wrote underneath that R is a policy variable.
Yep. It's funny. It's like, so Jamie Galbraith has a piece at the Levy Economics Institute on precisely this. And I don't know what year he published it, but it's old enough that David could have found it by now, where Jamie makes precisely this argument. So, and this is taking the conventional fiscal sustainability model on its own terms. It's not even taking issue with the model itself. Just says, okay, fine. You just laid out the conditions under which the ratio does not trend in an explosive direction, but converges. And so hence you get a sustainable fiscal path. By definition, with the growth rate exceeding the real rate of growth exceeding. And Jamie said exactly what you said. Well, he's in fact, his exact words in the policy note from the Levy Institute were, it's the interest rate, stupid, which is a sort of play on an old line we hear often here in the US, it's the economy, stupid, which James Carville, who was one of Bill Clinton's advisors, famously quipped, it's the economy, stupid. Jamie said, it's the interest rate, stupid. The interest rate is a policy variable. If you want R less than G, make R less than G, right? By policy, set the interest rate below. And then you can all take a nice deep breath and relax about the explosive fiscal path, because you've just destined it to converge by policy decision. So I'll take a look at what's in that thread, because that should be obvious.
Of course, they always go back to the Taylor rule when you talk about that, and accuse you of a monetary policy which is going to be inflationary because you're not setting interest rates high enough. You've got negative real interest rates or very low real interest rates.
Like Japan has had. With its,
yes, I mean that's the point. What I'm making is that the way in which the relationship between interest rates and inflation is described in mainstream economics is not the way that we would describe it.
That is correct.
Yeah, there is no simple relationship between interest rate policy and inflation. There are, of course, some MMT economists, including Warren, who argue that the relationship is the other way around.
Well, I think, okay, so a couple of things. I think that Warren has been more careful. Yeah, okay. Sometimes he quips things like, people who follow him, well, central banks all have the interest rate thing backwards. He'll say that. They have it backwards. But then in his more careful writing and I think speaking, he's more nuanced. And it isn't as simple as saying, raising interest rates means inflation as conventionally reported CPI or PCE or whatever. That raising interest rates will push inflation higher and reducing interest rates will move inflation lower. He isn't making that claim, although I know sometimes it sounds like it. It's a more nuanced claim, and it's about, forces working at cross purposes and which one dominates. So Warren likes to point out that when central banks raise interest rates to fight inflation, one of the first order effect, he says, is raising interest rates will put more money in people's pockets, right? Because as interest rates go higher and governments are rolling over maturing bonds now at higher rates of interest, bondholders are going to have more interest income. And of course, you can spend interest income the same way you can spend wage income. It's spendable.
Especially in countries with a lot of government debt like the US, where there's a big...
Yes. And then average maturity of the debt matters, and how much of it is getting rolled over at higher rates, and decisions about what maturity to issue and all that sort of stuff. But the point is, you are going to end up spending more. So right now, if you look at the CBO reports, CBO says, as a consequence of the Fed's raising interest rates, tightening, the Treasury is going to spend about an additional $1 trillion this decade because of the Fed raising interest rates. Okay, so that's not nothing, about an extra $1 trillion in the hands of bondholders as a consequence of raising interest rates. So Warren's point is, some of that money can and will be spent, right? Chasing after goods and services. So you're raising interest rates to fight inflation, but you're raising interest rates is producing, more money in the hands of people who could turn around and spend it. So there's at least one channel through which rate hikes could potentially exacerbate inflation by giving people more money to spend. And then I would say there are at least two more. Another is that raising interest rates raises the cost of borrowing, and firms that rely on debt to finance their productive activities, if they're borrowing short term and rolling over debt in a rising interest rate environment, their costs are increasing. So everybody sort of looks at businesses and says, well, they raise prices when wages go up. They raise prices when, materials costs increase. Why wouldn't they raise prices when borrowing costs increase? If they're trying to protect their profit margins, right, and their costs are increasing, does it really matter if it's interest expense or wages or anything else? So firms may raise prices to protect margins as interest rates increase. So there's another channel through which rising interest rates can get to rising prices. And then the third is a more medium or longer term, and that is you're raising interest rates. And so you're raising the cost of investing, right? If we talked earlier about the Inflation Reduction Act and the climate spending. If interest rates are going up, it's more expensive if you're a developer, to put up an apartment complex or to build single family homes, right? It's more expensive to expand your capacity. If you're a company and you have manufacturing capacity, it's more expensive now to borrow and finance the expansion. So over time, you end up with a smaller housing stock, right? Less productive capacity in your economy. And so with less productive capacity, you can also bump up against those bottlenecks and have inflationary pressures down the road as a consequence of, having less supply than you otherwise would have. So, and then on the other side, it is also true that raising interest rates works to, reduce borrowing and spending. So fewer people are borrowing to buy a home and a car and all those other things. So it's a matter of, which forces win out. Whether you
absolutely, and some of it's a redistribution. There are old people like me with term deposits do better when interest rates go up, of course. I think I could probably talk to you about these things for not how long we've been going, 40 minutes, probably 400 minutes without us running out of things to say. But I better not keep you any longer today. So, Stephanie, thank you very much for talking to us. It's been great. Thank you.
Super excited about what you're doing, and so glad that so many students have decided to take advantage of the opportunity to do these courses at Torrens and with you. And I hope I can drop by again. If you'll have me back, I'll come back.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. Very much so. I'm sure you'll be over at some point. I hope sooner rather than later.
Okay.
Right. It's great to see you.
Okay.
And
You too.
thanks again.
You bet.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Are we done?
We're done.